Good morning, everyone. Thank you. My name is Ian Barczewski, and I'm a developer on the Ameren MTC team. And as you can see, today we're going to be talking about imposter syndrome. And before we start this talk, I want to bring up three things. First, I want to give thanks to John Sextro, Matt Todd, Matt Johnson, and Allison Hawk. We had a talk about 2 weeks ago, and they brought up some really fantastic points and excellent insight that's used all over this talk. So again, thank you guys. I don't know where you guys are, but thank you. Second, this talk is set to a certain pace and rhythm because of time. So if you can hold off on any questions until the end, that'd be great. And third, yes, I am dealing with peak imposter syndrome right now about giving this talk on imposter syndrome. But I'm really excited to give this talk. I've been obsessed with this for the past 6 weeks. It turns out this topic is so much bigger than I ever thought it could be. So let's jump right into it. First, what is imposter syndrome? The term imposter syndrome was coined in a landmark paper in 1978 by two clinical psychologists, Dr. Suzanne Imes and Dr. Pauline Clance. And what they did is that they took 150 other graduate students in their therapy and they interviewed them. And what they started noticing is that they shared common phrases like, I don't deserve the success I got, or my success is due to luck, or I can't accept compliments and praise about my accomplishments. The definition of imposter syndrome reads, a concept describing high-achieving individuals who are marked by an inability to internalize their accomplishments and a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud. It continues, despite external evidence of their competence, those exhibiting the syndrome remain convinced that they are frauds and do not deserve the success that they have achieved. Proof of success is dismissed as luck, timing, or a result of deceiving others into thinking they are more intelligent and competent than they believe themselves to be. I've been dealing with imposter syndrome myself now since I started Asynchrony about 3 years ago, but I didn't really do a deep dive into it until I did this talk. And the next button's not working. Thanks, Google Slides. Never works when you give a talk. So it works for everyone else, right? So I was at my first job for a hair less than 4 years doing C# Windows forms and being surrounded by really complacent senior developers. And at some point, I realized I had to get out to grow and learn, and I wanted to be around other people who were passionate about technology. And due to insane strokes of luck, which I perceived as luck in my head when really I just did really well in my interview, I was able to get an interview, and I got hired. And when I got the offer letter, my first thought was, okay, they sent it to the wrong email address, obviously, right? So during my first week, I actually felt pretty good going through the training, the TDD course, the Agile course, what have you. And during the second week, it was completely different. At the end of that week, my girlfriend asked me, how's it going at Asynchrony? And I told her, I shouldn't be here. I am working with developers who are 1,000 times better than I am. They're dropping terms left and right that I have never heard of, bringing up techniques that I never would have considered in my life. And I've replayed that conversation in my head 1,000 times. There would be times where I would be pairing with someone and they'd have me pass a really simple test and I'd start shaking. I'd start sweating. I'd literally freeze up because I was so paralyzed that that developer would figure me out, that I'm not as good as I think I am. And so I still deal with this on a weekly basis. I actually sometimes start believing that people see me differently than I see myself. So this is how people probably see me. They see me as cool, confident, a Mac user, positive, go to the computer, probably funny, still has a full head of hair. But this is how I actually see myself. Thank you. I think my skills are garbage, and people just haven't figured it out yet. If I make a small mistake, even if it takes like 2 minutes to fix, I obsess with it the entire day. And I go home and I start writing code for hours to prove to myself that I am a good developer. And if I take a break for longer than 3 or 4 minutes, I start thinking that I'm not a real developer because real developers don't take breaks. But I hold no one else to this standard, only myself. And to give another example of the imposter syndrome and how that loop works in my head, here's a story about this very talk, starting from the very beginning. So I was at my desk and I got the email about my talk getting accepted, and I got up and went over to some of my coworkers like Joe and Nick. And I said, my talk got accepted and you have to go to it, deal with it. And they seemed really excited about it. It actually built me up a little bit. I even went out with my friends that night to celebrate. The next day was completely different. I realized I have to write a 35 to 40-minute talk about something I know next to nothing about. And so I opened up my laptop, and I opened up a Google Keep document, and nothing came to paper. I started feeling dread. I started feeling worry. I started feeling panic. And my mind started thinking two different things. The first thing it started thinking was, you don't deserve to be up there. People are going to figure you out that you are a fraud and you don't need to be there. And the second thing it thought was, do I really have imposter syndrome? I started having imposter syndrome about whether or not I had imposter syndrome. So throughout the weeks, I would end up overworking on this talk. I have spent hours upon hours rehearsing, rewriting, reading. I even went so far as to contact Dr. Pauline Clance, who was one of the original co-authors on this study, and we talked for 20 minutes about this. And to show you how bad it actually got, one night I gave myself a rare break, and I decided for some reason to watch WALL-E. And halfway through the movie, I thought to myself, I wonder if WALL-E has ever dealt with imposter syndrome. I had to get out. I had to. So after the talk is over, I'll probably feel a huge sigh of relief. And some people might come up to me and give me compliments, and I'll appreciate that. But what will happen is over the next few days, I'll start to overlook my successes, and I'll actually start focusing on what I did wrong. Did I explain this concept right? Did this joke land? Did I use the right words when I was talking about this? And any success that comes after that is going to evaporate. No matter what anyone tells me, I'm just going to write it off as an accident or a misunderstanding. And that's what we do, us who deal with imposter syndrome. Successes are just accidents to us. And so the next time that another opportunity comes up, this loop's just going to start all over again. And so what I started thinking was, who else in the tech community deals with this? There's got to be someone, right? And I was really surprised at who I found dealt with this. For example, Scott Hanselman. He's a really well-known .NET blogger. And he said, I feel like a phony sometimes. Sometimes I joke, hey, it's a good day. My badge still works. Or I answer, how are you with, I'm still working. Sheryl Sandberg, who is the COO of Facebook, said, there are still days when I wake up feeling like a fraud, not sure I should be where I am. This woman is 7th in the top 100 most influential women in Forbes, and she's in the top 100 most influential people in Time, and she feels like a fraud. John Skeet, who's one of the most respected programmers out there, and he's at the top of Stack Overflow with 963,000 points, says, every one of my colleagues, including myself, all feel like we managed to squeak through and fool our friends into thinking that we have some special powers that we don't have ourselves. He later said in this interview about Google, everyone here is really, really smart. How did I get here? And just to show how respected this guy's code is, there's a joke about John Skeet that says, when his code doesn't compile, the compiler apologizes. But there's some truth to that joke, right? I mean, obviously the compiler doesn't apologize, but the community loves what this guy does, and he feels like a fraud. And so I started thinking, who else deals with this? Maybe we can expand out to the science community. And it turns out it's even prevalent there. Dr. Margaret Chan, who's until last month was the Director General of the World Health Organization for over 10 years, said, there are an awful lot of people out there who think I'm an expert. How do these people believe all this about me? I'm so much more aware of all the things I know. Neil Armstrong, who's an astronaut and an aerospace engineer, and he's the first person to walk on the moon, said, I just look at these people and I think, what the heck am I doing here? They made amazing things. I just went where I was sent. So clearly, this is a thing that's in the tech and science community. So I started wondering, what about celebrities? What if we expanded the scope out to celebrities? And this shocked me because turns out the Fresh Prince may not be as confident and cool as you thought he was. He said, I still doubt myself every single day. What people believe is my self-confidence is actually my reaction to fear. Amy Poehler, who's a female comedian who has been nominated for 9 Emmys in a row now, said, you will never climb Career Mountain and get to the top and shout, I made it. You will rarely feel done or complete or even successful. Most people I know struggle with that complicated soup of feeling slighted on one hand and like a total fraud on another. And I was kind of caught off guard about this because I thought this was only a developer thing. And maybe that was my imposter syndrome talking. So what I did was I sent a survey out to the company and I asked about experience and all that. And I was expecting to get 30, 40, 50 responses and try to work something out of that. I got 173 responses. That's 40% of this company. That's a great sample size. So thank you again for responding to that. So let's go through each of the questions, because these numbers are really surprising. The first one is, have you experienced imposter syndrome in your career? 85% of people said that they have dealt with this in their career, and 12% said no. And what's really interesting is that if you have less than 2 years of experience, 88% said yes. And if you had 10 plus years experience, 84% of them said yes. It doesn't matter what your experience is, people deal with this. It is a really relevant issue. So I scoped it down to 12 months and said, and asked again whether or not you experienced imposter syndrome. And this still shocked me. 69% of participants said yes. That's barely a 15% drop. That's in the past year. That means that if we assume that this is a decent representation of the company, 7 out of 10 people that you see walking around have dealt with this in the past year. And last I asked, have you experienced imposter syndrome in the past month? Yes and no were separated by 1 vote. Yes took 49% of the responses. I expected this number to be around 20%. So when I saw that this was 49%, that shocked me. This means, again, if this is a decent representation of the company, every other person in this room in the past 30 days, which is not that long of a time span, has dealt with imposter syndrome. So I'm going to share a small set of the responses that I got that asked, what were your experiences with imposter syndrome? Some of these are lightly edited because there were some grammatical errors or the length was a little long, but the spirit of the message is still the same. So first was, when I was in my first years of graduate school, I felt that I would at any moment be exposed as a fraud and that I didn't deserve the scholarships and grants that I had earned. It took me 3 years working with a cognitive psychologist to understand the source of that insecurity and develop strategies to overcome those emotions so that I could thrive. Best investment I ever made. I chose this one because I really wanted to highlight how much people can struggle with imposter syndrome. This person spent 3 years working with a cognitive psychologist to overcome it. It's not just a fleeting thought for some people. Next, coming to asynchrony, the imposter syndrome was the worst it's ever been in my career. My 10 years of development experience felt worthless compared to all the hotshot developers around me. This is coming from someone who has been in the industry for a long time and immediately felt outclassed the moment they got to asynchrony. Is that because we have too steep of a learning curve, or are we really not that great at onboarding new employees? We're going to talk about that in a little bit, but keep that one in your head. This next one says, all of it. I don't deserve this job. Sometimes I just wonder how I got here. Yes, I worked hard, but there's also a considerable amount of luck involved. I suppose I'm just thankful. This reads like it came out straight out of the papers I read about imposter syndrome. There are classic imposter syndrome signs all over this. And objective statements like, I don't deserve this job. I wonder how I got here. There is also a considerable amount of luck involved. I've heard people say this out loud at asynchrony. And as employees, I want us to try to recognize what might be going on when people are saying these type of things. So this next one is actually a personal favorite of mine, and whoever sent this, thank you. In the survey, they responded they had dealt with imposter syndrome in the past year. And when asked for their experience, they said, no. No. This next one, have you ever heard something that just riled you up so much, a hot take that was so bad that you had to shut your laptop and go for a walk or go take a nap or something? This one reads, when I'm pairing with someone and they make a crack about me not getting something fast enough because I'm a girl. Side note, if you're doing this, stop it. Stop doing this. It's 2017. This is bad. I'm not even talking about from an imposter syndrome perspective. Please, we need to stop saying things like this. I don't know who said yup, but thank you. There's a lot of research done about how gender, race, ethnicity play into imposter syndrome. We're going to talk about that later, but keep this one in your head. It's important. So next, we're going to explain why imposter syndrome is so widespread in the tech community. So first off is the speed of change. We go through tech stacks extremely fast. You have some cornerstone languages like C# and Java, but anyone who's worked in the web development industry knows that libraries turn over extremely fast. I've had web developers who have told me how shocked they were when they found out that Angular was on version 4. And because of this fast turnover, people who are experts in other fields but might not be experts in something like web development start to feel irrelevant. They start to feel behind, and they feel like they can't keep up in discussions with their coworkers. And because of that, they start feeling real serious case of imposter syndrome. And not only that, but in other companies, you get hired to do a tech stack like .NET, and you stay as a .NET developer for the majority of your career there. But at Asynchrony, you can change tech stacks once or twice a year. I got hired 3 years ago to be a .NET developer. I haven't touched .NET in 2 years. So next up is open source collaboration. A lot of us here not only rely on open source to implement our solutions, but we actually contribute to open source projects and sometimes actually starting our own. And by putting our work out into the public, we're allowing our standards, our processes, our flaws, our mistakes, our habits to be peer reviewed by any developer who has a computer, an internet connection, and any interest in our project. And you might write the best solution you've ever written, this 300-line beauty, and someone comes and zaps it down to five lines. And you start thinking, I wrote the best thing I've ever written, and someone just came and bulldozed it. How am I supposed to feel as a developer? Should I still be a developer? Am I just really bad at this? We tie a lot of ourselves in our code, and it's really hard to deal with that sometimes. Next up is introverted personalities. The tech field is loaded with introverts. And introverts have been shown to ruminate on these feelings of imposter syndrome, as opposed to extroverts who sometimes let it slip out more easily that they deal with imposter syndrome. And because of this, imposter syndromes are more likely to create these internal feedback cycles since they're not willing to talk about these things. It's really hard to get any introvert to open up about anything. Everyone in here knows that. I personally think that it is crucial that we create an environment where introverts can open up and have these discussions with us, or else they're going to be stuck in these feedback cycles and not get anything done. Next up is limited expertise. Now, this goes hand in hand with what we were talking about with speed of change. When people who talk to me who are not in the IT industry bring up a technology, they assume that I just know how to do it. And when you see how many ways there are to implement different solutions in the tech world, it can be absolutely crushing. The sheer scope is just staggering. And when you're an expert in, say, React, but you've never deployed to AWS before, having to put those training wheels back on and learn it can be really embarrassing, especially when you get paired with a developer who's an expert at it and is dropping terms left and right that you've never heard. Having such all-wide enveloping experience is a pipe dream in this industry. It's unrealistic. But despite that, we still end up feeling inadequate. We feel fraudulent. We feel incompetent. Next up is the pressure to achieve. Now, studies have shown that this is actually really relevant in households where you grew up, where you had high intelligence people or high achieving members that gave you constant praise and criticism. Being told that you're gifted your entire life and then being placed into a situation where you have to face with people who have decades of experience can make you seem unprepared. It can make you feel like you don't belong there. And some aspects of this would be like working hard to achieve that no one exposes you as an imposter, which brings higher praise, which perpetuates the feelings of imposter syndrome, which brings harder work, which causes more burnout and sleep deprivation. Or giving the answers to a supervisor or a boss that they want to hear, despite that not maybe being the answer they need to hear. And connected to that, these people will develop relationships with these bosses and managers in order to push their creative and intellectual abilities. But when these same bosses and managers start giving them praise, they write it off. They start saying, they're only saying that because they're a friend of mine. So next up is the feeling of isolation for minorities. A study done by the University of Texas in 2013 highlighted that minority students were more likely to experience feelings of imposter syndrome and thus had higher dropout rates. Minorities would report feeling isolated, where they felt that they had to work twice as hard to be able to break through the stereotypes that were placed on them. For example, if this person is X, then they're not intelligent. If this person is Y, then they should already know how to do that. And furthermore, other people said that they felt like their skills and their achievements weren't real because the college or the company that they worked for only gave them that because of a affirmative action or a diversity quota. There have been various studies done on this regarding race, ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation. It doesn't matter. The results are all the same. But if studies don't work for you, go to YouTube, search imposter syndrome, look at the thumbnails and the presenters in the first 5 pages, then do the same thing but search programming. You're going to see a huge difference in who's talking. These people are trying to talk to us, and we need to listen. Next up is, how does it affect you when you're dealing with imposter syndrome? So first off, anxiety and depression. Imposter syndrome has been known to cause serious cases of depression and anxiety. Depression because you have this constant feeling that you have to put on this facade so that no one figures you out. Anxiety because you're constantly terrified that someone's going to rip that mask off and reveal this distorted perception that you have of yourself. And even worse, imposter syndrome can actually cause existing diagnoses of anxiety and depression to be even worse, possibly heading towards neurosis. And these can lead to serious cases of sleeplessness, burnout, a weakened immune system. Next up is self-sabotage. This is a very, very real effect of imposter syndrome. Some examples would be like never finishing your work, never going to meetings, procrastinating. And what you're probably telling yourself is, those sound like signs of incompetence, not imposter syndrome. Well, if you don't finish your work, no one sees it, and thus it never gets criticized. If I don't come to AIC today, you guys don't see this presentation, and no one gets to rip it up in shreds. If I procrastinate, you can blame it on a lack of preparation instead of not being competent enough to actually do the work. But when you succeed, you end up raising that bar in your mind higher, which means you start working harder to meet that bar, which means you fall back on those same destructive cycles that we've been talking about. And next up is your relationships start to deteriorate. In the workplace, this can mean that you start pushing out members of your team or your project or even your company, which means that you'll cause massive strife and problems. Coworkers will also struggle to give you any sort of real feedback because they feel like that they have to walk on eggshells the entire time. And in your home life, that means that no one's going to be able to reach out to you because they're constantly afraid that they're going to cause a serious case of imposter syndrome. All of these combined can have damaging effects to your life and health, including taking less risks, pursuing less opportunities, or being unaware of just how badly your mental and physical health are deteriorating. So what can I do to help myself overcome imposter syndrome? First off, accept that awareness is a good thing. The mere fact that you are so critical of your abilities in your role is a sign that you care. You have real, honest pride in your work. Your recognition of dealing with imposter syndrome already puts you one step ahead. Without knowing of what you're going through, you won't even be able again to overcome it, and you'll lock yourself into those cycles of burnout and depression and anxiety. If the people like I showed you before, like John Skeet and Sheryl Sandberg, can achieve mastery while working with imposter syndrome, you can too. Next up is, don't be afraid to ask for help. Asking for help from an expert is terrifying. You ask an expert in a field to come pair with you, and they sit down and they write 5 lines of code, and all of a sudden they've created sentient artificial intelligence. But when you don't know what to do, not asking for your help is even worse. The solution you're going to implement is wrong. You're going to be robbing yourself of an opportunity to learn. You're going to be dishonest with your team about what you know and what you don't know. You have limitations, but you also have strengths. Asking for help is going to turn one of those limitations into a new strength for you. And asking for help doesn't mean just from a technical perspective. Many people have someone here that they turn to guidance, like a mentor, or a close friend, or a family member. And simply having someone reliable to talk to can help you break out of these struggles. There's nothing wrong with asking someone to be a mentor for you. My current mentee, Matt Todd, has a decade of experience on me, but we've had really productive talks about his progression at Asynchrony and in his career. A mentor can do wonders for you, and conveniently, we have an excellent mentor-mentee program at Asynchrony right now. Next up is reevaluate what you're telling yourself. There's a type of therapy used in psychology called cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT for short, where the methods involve changing the language and patterns of thinking behind a patient's struggles, and in turn, how they feel. Part of that is looking at what you're telling yourself in situations and rephrasing it. For example, you might be telling yourself, I only got this job because of luck. Well, why do you think it's luck? I think it's luck because I tricked these 2 developers into thinking I was good. Why do you think they think that you're good? If you're logically honest with yourself, you can start digging down to the root of the issues and get to the real reasons why you're saying these things. And from there, the therapist will have you start rephrasing things like, I got this job because I was qualified and talented enough to do the work, and I am competent enough to do this. Next up is stop comparing yourself to that person. If I were to compare myself to some others in this industry, then I would tell you that you have no reason to be here. John Skeet has written blog posts about this. Sheryl Sandberg has discussed this a billion times in her talks. I would never get anything done because I'll never be what they are. Why talk about these things when the experts already have? But you are here. People have pulled me aside to discuss imposter syndrome with me. I might not be the CEO of Facebook or at the top of Stack Overflow, but these people have come to me, and that demonstrates that I have worth. You're not here to live John Skeet or Sheryl Sandberg's life. You're here to live the life that you can. We all have that habit of picking someone in asynchrony and constantly comparing ourselves to that person. Stop it. Stop doing that. Stop comparing yourself to that person. Respect what makes you up and respect your own experience. You're not them, but that doesn't make you a fraud. Next up is remind yourself that being wrong doesn't make you a fraud. This is a lot harder for people than it sounds. It's hard for me. Many of the responses that I got from people were about how their imposter syndrome was rooted in the fear of being wrong. People who are tech leads, people who are project managers, people that we turn to for guidance. I'm here to remind you that every single person in this room is going to be wrong, and probably sooner than later. I'm wrong every single day. I had hard-boiled eggs for the first time last week. I thought they were going to be disgusting. They're delicious. They're great. Being wrong in this industry doesn't make you a fraud. The best developers still misspell variables. The best QAs still forget to check all their browsers. The best designers still accidentally turn all the text on a page red. Your mistakes are an opportunity to learn. Don't use them as a weapon against yourself. Next up is seek therapy. Imposter syndrome can not only cause anxiety and depression, but it can also spawn from the same underlying illnesses. Along with CBT, which I mentioned earlier, two other effective forms of therapy are coherence therapy and writing therapy. Coherence therapy says that your moods and behaviors are tied to your implicit and unconscious constructs of reality. And that's a little bit of a mouthful, so I'm sorry. The therapist would then have you confront these constructs of realities with real, serious emotional experiences in order to revise or dissolve them. And what writing therapy says is that one's feelings are gradually eased from trauma by writing about them. And so what therapists will do is that they'll administer this writing therapy by having you write from different contexts. For example, I would write from the perspective of me writing an unsent letter to a coworker. And then I would write from that coworker's experience back to me. Or I'd write a letter to my brain and have a dialogue and try to figure out why my brain is saying those things and list out my real objectives and start reconnecting with reality again. Speaking from personal experience, therapy is incredibly powerful and useful. The social stigmas about mental health are falling away. Mental health is just as important as physical health. Don't be afraid to speak to a therapist. We have insurance at Asynchrony that covers mental health just as well as physical health. That's rare. If you feel comfortable confiding in your coworkers, by the way, the mental health channel on the Slack channel, mental health, right? Those people there are the most helpful, positive human beings imaginable. And as an AIC plug, Allison and Arwen are hosting their Agile Practices for Better Mental Health Talk at 11:05 if you need a starting point. So what can you do to help overcome others who are dealing with imposter syndrome? First off, manage your team environment. In a supportive team environment, when someone can say, I don't understand this, everyone else should be able to step up and fill in the gaps instead of showing hostility and frustration. Having a negative team environment not only decreases the trust and the productivity in the team, but it makes it impossible for people who are dealing with imposter syndrome to be upfront and honest about what they're going through, and it makes it less willing for them to ask for help. And this will make a massive, massive difference in being able to quell those feelings of imposter syndrome early, especially if you can make that person feel like they're contributing positively to the team. Next up is be aware of your language choices. So I want to dive into this one a little bit. I'm not trying to say that you should be nice or careful with all your words. That's absolutely unrealistic. However, IT people in general, we kind of suck, guys. We're kind of stubborn. And as John Sextor said, we deal with people who tend to rip up our code and not be nice about it. He said, you don't go to a surgeon and have them badmouth another surgeon's work that they did on you. We have a lot of self-worth tied up in our job. And something that runs through the IT crowd is that we're told our entire lives that we are geniuses with technology. And then someone comes along and says, that thing you did, there's a better way to do it. I'm going to do it. And this is really tough when you're dealing with someone who's toxic and you're in a code review with them. Everyone's gone through that. It's miserable. We get defensive. And what happens is they start changing our code and we say, you have ripped my code apart. And by doing that, you're attacking me as a person. So when you're combining this with a developer who may be dealing with imposter syndrome, it can cause some serious internal issues. There's a better way to approach feedback, and we need to recognize that. And not only should we consider how we respond to negative feedback, but we can inadvertently cause issues with our responses to positive feedback. For example, let's say I've been working on a tech stack for a year, and I'm decently familiar with it, and I get stuck on an issue. I pull Dan King aside, who's got like 5 years in this tech stack, and I say, Dan King, get over here, you're an expert. And so we pair, and he knocks it out, and I say, Dan King, you're the best. And Dan King does that like classic shoulder shrug, that lazy shoulder shrug that he does, the whole like thing that he does. And he's like, I'm like a 5 or a 6. Dan King's just trying to be humble, and I get it. But if Dan King's actually a 7 or an 8, by scaling his skills down to a 5 or 6, if I'm like a 3 or 4, even a 5, in my mind, he's scaling my skills down to like a 1 or a 2. If I'm only a 1 or 2 after a year, I'm going to feel like garbage. And furthermore, I'd like to reflect back on that previous survey reply that we talked about with the female. We can apply the information and lessons that we've learned from these experiences and studies all across the board. Without being aware of the phrases and choices that you're saying to a minority, you could even unintentionally be causing the feelings of imposter syndrome to be worse than they actually are, and thus continuing to perpetuate this distorted reality that they believe they have about their accomplishments and merits. A lot of these people already feel like they're being judged too harshly, or that they're being tested more than anyone else in the room. I mean, just imagine being a woman at Google or in the tech industry this past week with the anti-diversity manifesto. They feel like they have a target on their backs the entire time. No one needs that. They don't deserve that. They already have it hard enough as it is. And in this industry, we don't need to make it worse with our poor choices and word phrases. So consider what you're saying. Stop and think about the ramifications of every word. You could be wrecking careers by doing this. And next up is set expectations, especially for new employees. This is one that John Sextor brought up in our talk, and it really resonated with me. So when we get hired, we aren't really given any sort of expectations at Asynchrony. You got hired, so obviously you met some sort of bar, but beyond that, what expectations are we actually given? I wasn't given any. And hopefully you're put on a good team where they tell you these expectations. But a lack of expectations is going to make new people not know where they should be at productivity-wise. For someone like me, day one, I felt like I immediately had to be on the same page as 3 legitimately senior developers, despite being nowhere near a senior developer level. And that really messed me up. It was really hard for me to deal with that. I set expectations on myself that were unrealistic. And many of the responses that I got in the feedback said how they almost quit Asynchrony in the first 3 months, some as early as the first week. We should assume that people are going to struggle a little bit when they get here. When they're put on teams, they're going to usually need additional coaching and guidance to transition into our culture and the way we do things here. We need to make sure that new people are put on good teams and that we set expectations for them and we make it clear what those expectations are. The onus needs to be on each of our teams to make sure that new people are given a chance to thrive. They're eased in because based on the feedback that I was given, this is a consistent, serious problem and it needs to be addressed. So there was a response that I got on the survey that I held until the very end of this talk because I wanted to bring it up because I think it's a good way to to transition into the conclusion of this. And that response reads, I don't think I've ever encountered this in my career. Is imposter syndrome something that's common or known to persist among asynchrony employees? That response really caught me off guard because I had read a bunch of feedback about how people dealt with this, and this, I think, was the first negative response that I got back. So I hope that after this talk, every single person in this room agrees that, yes, this is a problem, and yes, we can do something about it. I want to remind you of that stat that every other person in this room, based on that survey, is dealing with it. That number is 50%. I want to challenge everyone in this room to do one thing. I want you to walk away from this talk, take this information, and start thinking about how you can not only help yourself with imposter syndrome, but start thinking about how you can help others deal with it. I want to get that number that's at 50% down. Asynchrony is an amazing place. This is the best place I've ever worked, and I don't want to leave. But it can be better. I want to get us to a place where people can come to work feeling empowered, feeling productive, and above all else, feeling like they deserve to be where they are, and they deserve the accomplishments that they've been given. All right, any questions? None, really?
None of us are qualified to give you it.
I just want to say that I've told people that I am legit terrified of the Q&A, that this is where the imposter syndrome was worse, and right now there's only one question. Please don't ruin this for me.
When you're talking about setting expectations, one of the things that may be helpful, or maybe you might think would be helpful, could we change the mentorship program for new employees to help with setting those expectations? I know when I was being a mentor, this kind of thing came up multiple times with people I've been mentoring, and I had, in each individual way, had to deal with it, but there's no guidelines for that. So is that something that maybe we could help change?
I agree. So the question was, in a nutshell, is there something in the mentorship program that we can change to help this, right? I'm not qualified to give that answer because I'm not a higher up, but that is something that I actually had to cut from my talk because of length, but I absolutely agree with you. I think, again, setting those expectations early will help new people come on. And we have an onboarding team. I think we still have it, I'm not sure. But when we did have it, I noticed that it was just new people. There wasn't anyone to actually give them any real guidance. It was just new people telling new people what to do. That's not a good way to do our culture. So yes, I absolutely agree. We should be revamping our mentorship program and make it not just be about free lunches either. Because that's what a lot of people think it is, and it's not. But free lunches are great. I'm not disagreeing. Oh God, this is where the imposter syndrome is starting to hit.
By the way, I experienced it as well, so I was probably in that 7%.
Thank you.
So it's not just developers; it's all of us. But no, in terms of mentorship, absolutely appropriate, great suggestion, great idea. You don't have to be a higher up, whatever that is. You don't have to be a higher up to help us implement it, right? Because all of us in this room, we know people are acting as mentors, and it's great feedback with Jenna. And I know Lauren Campbell is also helping with that initiative. It's out
Awesome.
Wayfinders. So the Wayfinder program, great suggestion. Let's not let it drop with the suggestion, but carry that forward.
I was told to repeat what was said. So Jim said that it's a great suggestion, and he also said that my talk was the best he's ever seen. So thank you. I appreciate that. Yeah, I think he said something about I'm getting a raise next week, right? Right? Yeah.
Do you think there are any benefits to having imposter? For example, you talked about and identify with it that it sometimes leads to increased drive to make sure that you improve X, Y. So do you think there are any benefits to it?
Absolutely. So the question was, do I think that there are any benefits to having imposter syndrome? For myself, personally, it has made me spend nights, since working at Asynchrony, learning new tech stacks that I've never heard of. I spent a week straight learning Ruby on Rails because I didn't want to embarrass Nick, because I embarrass Nick all the time. And because of that, my drive as an employee has increased tenfold. I wasn't doing this at my last job. I would go home and play video games all day. And now like I'm building my own applications. I just launched a website like 2 weeks ago. I'm not going to talk about it because it's a funny website, but yeah, I think there are massive benefits, but it's a person by person thing. Like I said, for me, it's a case of drive. So, anyone else, please? We have 5 minutes. There we go.
Yeah, so there's this idea of fake it till you make it as a way to overcome that insecurity. How do you see that idea similar or different than imposters?
Different. Fake it till you make it doesn't work. I really don't think it works at Asynchrony. Because if you try to fake it until you make it here, you are going to be exposed immediately by how bad you are. So, yeah.
So I don't mean like actually fake it. I mean tell yourself that you're good until you feel like you're good. That's the idea. Fake it till you make it. Not that you.
I thought you meant. And again, to repeat the question again, he asked what I thought about in regards to fake it till you make it, playing into imposter syndrome. Maybe that works. This is another case-by-case thing, but what helps is not only telling yourself that, but having other people tell you that until you actually get it in your head that you are good. I would go out to lunch with Andrew, and he would tell me, like, you are a solid developer. And then the next day, I'd just be like, nah, he's wrong. He's just being nice. He's got a great mustache, and he's being nice to me. Or, Nick, who is... Oh, or, Nick, who was so, Nick and Kenny and Michael were so patient with me when we were doing the Rubies on Rails stuff. I had to sit there and constantly tell myself, like, you're going to get this. It's going to click. Even while I was dealing with the imposter syndrome that you were talking about, I had to show a flare of confidence to you guys until eventually it did click that I did get it. And you guys constantly telling me that, hey, you are good, instead of, why don't you get this yet? Really helps. So I agree that fake it till you make it does work in that regard, but it also helps to have a supportive team environment also telling you the same thing. Because if we're pairing with toxic people, and I'm going to be honest, they exist here. I don't think that's an open secret, or I don't think that's any secret at all. But if you pair with someone toxic and you're trying to tell yourself that you are good, and this person's telling you, you're terrible, stop being a developer. And I've heard people say this. I've heard people say that. It doesn't help. It doesn't. So it's a combination.
You talked a little bit about interactions with feedback on how you talk to each other. One of the things that I was wondering about is you talked a little bit about negative feedback,
Mm-hmm.
but do you think there's value in keying in on people when they are unwilling to accept positive feedback? So one of the things that I struggle with is accepting positive feedback, and that you brush it off, or they compliment you and you say, well, that's just luck, or all of these key things that you were talking about. Is there a right or wrong kind of place to call them on that and say, no, this is because you worked hard, and I want you to accept this compliment that I'm giving you?
So to try to summarize what you just asked, you asked, is there appropriate place and time to key in on when you are giving positive feedback, but they aren't actually accepting it? I think there absolutely is. I really do. And again, like we were just talking about, eventually you're going to have to pull that person aside and say, look, you need to stop beating yourself up because I've seen it wreck your productivity when you do it. And that's and keying in on that positive feedback, to me, is still positive feedback. It's not negative. Instead of saying, hey, stop it, I'm sick of this, start telling yourself you're good. That's not good. So yeah, I think there's absolutely a place and time. It's obviously a personality thing. And I've had people pull me aside and mention it. It was a really bad issue when I was on Boy Scouts. And eventually Tim Earhart, who never works with me, just pulled me aside and said, like, stop doing this. You are better than me. And he has like 5 years experience on me in .NET. And eventually just, it clicked finally. It finally clicked to me. And I think for me, that's when my imposter syndrome started getting less severe, was when he did key in on that, on my unwillingness to accept positive feedback. Can I do one more or not? Let's make this fast, buddy.
So you said that
nice and think, does Wally have imposter syndrome?
Yeah, he doesn't.
So, is it worth it? Is it worth the toll on you?
He asked whether imposter syndrome is worth this toll on me because I work really hard, but at the same time, I have sleepless nights and whatnot. At its lowest points, nothing makes me want to crawl outside of my skin and exist somewhere else than imposter syndrome. It is the worst. The other night, I was up till 4 a.m. I went to bed at 12, but I was scared sick of giving this talk. Those moments, yeah, it's terrible. But at the same time, it's caused me to have this insane drive that's, you know, it's given people a way to come back to me and say, hey, you are good at this. And that validation is nice. Or, you know, Jim comes up to me and says, you are such a great developer. Here's a huge pay raise. So yeah, imposter syndrome in that regard is great. But there's going to become a point in your life, if you deal with imposter syndrome, where you're going to have to weigh, are these feelings worth it? Is it only because of this industry? And that's something you have to ask yourself. All right, I think that's it. Thanks, guys. Thanks.